Welcome to Midnight Tales, where the darkness reveals its deepest secrets. I'm your host, and tonight I want to tell you about something that happened just 3 months ago. Something that changed everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. My name is David Chen, and until recently, I worked as a late-night radio DJ at WKRP 103.7, a small station in the mountains of West Virginia. For 5 years, I'd been the voice that kept insomniacs and night shift workers company during the darkest hours. I thought I'd heard every strange story, every conspiracy theory, every urban legend that existed. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday night in October. The autumn air was crisp, and fog had settled thick around our transmission tower, making the world outside my studio window look like something from another realm. I was halfway through my usual midnight show when the phone rang. Now, I got calls all the time. Lonely truckers, conspiracy theorists, people who just needed someone to talk to in the dead of night. But this call was different. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper, crackling with static that shouldn't have been there on our digital system. "You need to stop broadcasting," the voice said. It was impossible to tell if it was male or female, young or old. The words seemed to echo, as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "Excuse me," I replied, keeping my voice professional despite the chill that ran down my spine. "This is a live show, caller. Did you want to share something with our listeners?" "They're listening," the voice continued, ignoring my question. "They've always been listening, but tonight they're going to respond." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment, then shrugged it off. In 5 years of late-night radio, I'd received stranger calls. I went back to my playlist, spinning some classic rock to fill the dead air while I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. But the calls kept coming. Every 15 minutes, like clockwork, the phone would ring. Same voice, same static, same impossible echo. Each time the message was slightly different, but the theme remained constant. "Stop broadcasting. They're listening. Something is coming." By 2 a.m. I was genuinely unsettled. The fog outside had grown thicker, pressing against the studio windows like something alive. The transmission tower, usually visible through the mist, had completely disappeared. Even stranger, my equipment was acting up. The digital displays flickered randomly, showing numbers that made no sense. The audio levels jumped without explanation, and twice I caught what sounded like whispers bleeding through between songs. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Our listener count, displayed on the computer monitor, was climbing, rapidly. WKRP was a small station. On a good night, we might have 300 listeners tuned in. But the number on my screen showed over 2,000, then 3,000, then 5,000. It kept climbing, faster and faster, until it reached numbers that were impossible for our broadcast range. 50,000 listeners, 100,000, 200,000. The phone rang again. This time when I answered, I could hear something in the background behind that whispered voice. It sounded like breathing. Not one person breathing, but hundreds, maybe thousands, all breathing in perfect unison. "You should have stopped," the voice said. "Now it's too late. They're all listening. They're all waiting. And now, they're coming." I hung up and immediately tried to call my station manager, but my cell phone had no signal. The landline was dead except for those incoming calls. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in my studio with an audience that had grown to impossible numbers. That's when I heard the first knock. It came from the studio door, 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed through the small room. I froze, staring at the door. Our station was in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by a winding mountain road. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and I was the only person scheduled to be here tonight. Knock, knock, knock. I muted my microphone and crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The security camera monitor showed nothing but static. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Silence. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard my own voice. It was impossible. But there it was, my voice, speaking words I'd never said, broadcasting on a frequency that shouldn't exist. I rushed back to my equipment and scanned through the radio spectrum. And there it was, another signal, on a frequency that was supposed to be empty, carrying a broadcast that sounded exactly like my show. But the David Chen on that frequency was saying things I'd never said, playing songs that didn't exist, taking calls from people who spoke in languages I'd never heard. And the listener count for that impossible broadcast was climbing into the millions. The knocking came again, but this time it wasn't just at the door. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. A rhythmic pounding that seemed to match the beating of my heart. And with each knock, the static on my equipment grew louder, until it was almost drowning out everything else. I grabbed the emergency broadcast system, intending to send out a distress signal. But when I activated it, the only thing that came through the speakers was that whispered voice, now multiplied into a chorus of whispers that filled the studio. "Welcome to Midnight Tales," they said in unison, using my own catchphrase, "where the darkness reveals its deepest secrets." The lights went out. In the pitch-black studio, illuminated only by the glow of my equipment, I could see shapes moving outside the windows. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be made of the fog itself, pressing against the glass with hands that had too many fingers. The listener count on my monitor had reached 10 million. I realized then what was happening. Somehow, my broadcast had broken through to something else, some other realm where things that shouldn't exist were listening to our world through radio waves. And now, they were using my signal as a doorway. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out words in languages that predated human civilization. The shapes outside were no longer just pressing against the windows. They were coming through them, passing through the glass like it was water. I had one chance. I lunged for the master power switch, the one that would cut all power to the transmission tower and end the broadcast. But as my hand reached for it, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist. I looked down and saw fingers made of static and shadow, holding me back. The whispered voice spoke directly into my ear, no longer coming through the phone or speakers, but from something standing right behind me. "The broadcast must continue," it said. "They've been waiting so long to listen, and now they want to be heard." I fought against the grip, but more hands emerged from the darkness, holding me in place. On my monitor, I watched helplessly as the listener count climbed past 50 million, then 100 million. The impossible broadcast was reaching every radio on Earth and beyond. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of my own voice, speaking words I wasn't saying, welcoming listeners to a show that would never end. The shapes from the fog filled the studio, and I felt myself becoming part of something vast and ancient and hungry. When the authorities found the station 3 days later, they discovered something that defied explanation. The equipment was still running, still broadcasting, but the studio was empty. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of where I had gone. The only clue was a message written in condensation on the inside of the studio windows. "The broadcast continues. But here's the thing that will keep you awake tonight." The broadcast really did continue. If you know where to look on the radio spectrum, if you scan through the frequencies that aren't supposed to exist, you can still find it. You can still hear my voice, welcoming new listeners to Midnight Tales, sharing stories that come from places beyond our world. And every night, the audience grows larger. So I want you to remember something as you go about your daily life, as you drive past radio towers and see the red lights blinking in the darkness. Remember that somewhere out there, in frequencies between the ones we know, there are voices broadcasting to listeners who aren't entirely human. There are stories being told that were never meant for human ears. And sometimes, if you're listening carefully enough, if you're alone in the dark, with nothing but a radio for company, you might accidentally tune in to one of those broadcasts. You might hear your own name being called by a voice that sounds familiar but wrong. You might become part of an audience that spans dimensions. If that happens, whatever you do, don't respond. Don't call in. Don't let them know you're listening, because once they know you're there, once you become part of their audience, the broadcast never ends. Welcome to Midnight Tales. I'm your host and I'll be with you forever.